It was a dark and stormy night when John, an Uber driver, received a ride request from a mysterious passenger. He accepted the ride and headed towards the pickup location, located in a deserted area on the outskirts of the city. As he drove down the winding road, John began to feel uneasy. The darkness seemed to consume him, and the rain beating against his windshield made it difficult to see. He could feel his heart racing as he approached the pickup location, an old abandoned mansion. When he arrived, a tall, dark figure emerged from the shadows and approached his car. John rolled down his window, and the passenger leaned in, revealing his face to be twisted and grotesque. John felt a chill run down his spine, but he couldn't refuse the fare. The passenger instructed John to take him to a remote location deep in the woods. The rain intensified as they drove, and John began to feel as if they were going deeper and deeper into the darkness. Suddenly, the passenger began to laugh maniacally, and John's car swerved off the road. As John regained consciousness, he found himself tied up in the back seat of his own car. The passenger had disappeared, and he was alone in the woods. He tried to escape, but the ropes were too tight. Suddenly, he heard footsteps approaching the car. He could see the shadow of a figure approaching him. His heart pounded in his chest as the figure revealed itself to be the twisted passenger, wielding a sharp object. The passenger leaned in and whispered in John's ear, "You should have never accepted my ride." With that, the passenger plunged the sharp object into John's chest, and he let out a final scream as his life drained from his body. The passenger vanished into the darkness, leaving John's lifeless body alone in the woods. From that day forward, no one ever heard from John again, and the twisted passenger continued to haunt the streets, searching for his next victim. It was a dark and stormy night when Rachel decided to order an Uber. She had just left a party and was feeling a little tipsy. As she waited for her ride to arrive, she couldn't help but feel a sense of unease. The rain was coming down hard, and the wind was howling. But she tried to brush off her fears, telling herself it was just her imagination. Finally, a black car pulled up, and Rachel checked the license plate to confirm it was her Uber. She got in the back seat and gave the driver her address. As they drove through the empty streets, Rachel noticed that the driver was taking an unusual route. She tried to ask him why, but he didn't respond. She started to feel nervous. Suddenly, the car pulled into an abandoned parking lot. Rachel tried to open the door, but it was locked. She turned to the driver, but he had turned around, and she saw that his face was twisted into a terrifying grin. "Welcome to your worst nightmare," he said. Rachel screamed as the driver lunged at her with a knife. She fought back as best she could, but he was too strong. She felt the cold metal of the blade against her skin as he pinned her down. She knew she was going to die. Just when Rachel thought it was all over, she heard a knock on the car window. It was the police, responding to a call about a suspicious vehicle. The driver panicked and tried to flee, but he was quickly caught and arrested. Rachel was shaken but grateful to be alive. She vowed never to use Uber again and warned her friends to be careful when using ride-sharing services. She knew she would never forget the horror that had happened on that fateful night. Rachel spent the next few weeks in a state of shock. The image of the driver's twisted grin and the feel of the cold metal of the knife against her skin was burned into her memory. She couldn't stop thinking about what would have happened if the police hadn't arrived in time. She knew she was lucky to be alive. Rachel tried to put the experience behind her and move on with her life, but she couldn't shake the feeling of fear that lingered inside her. She couldn't bring herself to trust ride-sharing services again, and she began to feel anxious whenever she had to go out alone. Rachel's friends tried to comfort her, but they didn't understand the depth of her fear. They thought she was being paranoid and urged her to seek therapy, but Rachel couldn't bring herself to talk about what had happened. She felt ashamed and blamed herself for getting into the car in the first place. As the months passed, Rachel's fear turned into anger. She couldn't understand how something like this could happen to her. She began to research ride-sharing safety measures and was appalled to learn that many drivers had criminal records or had been accused of sexual assault. She realized that she had been too trusting and that the ride-sharing industry needed to do more to protect its passengers. Rachel decided to take action. She started a campaign to raise awareness about ride-sharing safety and to push for better background checks and safety measures. She reached out to other survivors of ride-sharing assaults and worked with organizations to advocate for change. She became a voice for those who had been victimized by ride-sharing drivers. Rachel's campaign gained national attention, and she became a prominent advocate for ride-sharing safety. She worked tirelessly to make sure that no one would have to go through the same horror she had experienced. She knew she couldn't change the past, but she could make a difference in the future. Years later, Rachel looked back on that night with a mixture of horror and gratitude. She was grateful to be alive and to have found a way to turn her trauma into something positive. She knew that the road to healing had been long and difficult, but she had emerged stronger and more determined than ever before. She was a survivor, and she was proud of the work she had done to make the world a safer place. It was a dark and stormy night when Sarah, a college student, called an Uber to take her back to her dorm after a late-night study session at the library. As she sat in the back seat of the car, scrolling through her phone, she noticed that the driver was taking a different route than usual. She shrugged it off, thinking that maybe he was avoiding traffic, but her unease grew as the car continued down an unfamiliar road. Suddenly, the driver pulled over to the side of the road and turned to face Sarah. His eyes were dark and menacing, and she could feel his breath on her face. "I'm sorry, Sarah," he said. "But I can't let you go." Sarah's heart raced as she tried to open the door, but it was locked. She frantically pounded on the window, hoping someone would hear her. But the road was deserted, and there was no one around to help her. The driver reached into his glove compartment and pulled out a knife. Sarah screamed as he lunged at her, but he was too quick. He sliced through her skin, drawing blood, and she felt the pain searing through her body. As Sarah lay bleeding and helpless in the back seat, she thought about her family and friends, and all the things she wished she could have done differently in her life. But it was too late now. She knew she was going to die. Just when Sarah thought it was all over, she heard a loud knock on the window. It was the police, responding to a call about a suspicious vehicle. The driver panicked and tried to flee, but he was quickly caught and arrested. Sarah was rushed to the hospital, where she underwent emergency surgery. She survived the attack, but the trauma of that night stayed with her for the rest of her life. She couldn't bring herself to trust anyone, let alone ride-sharing services like Uber. Years later, Sarah learned that the driver had been a serial killer, preying on unsuspecting passengers who trusted him to take them to their destinations. She was haunted by the thought that she could have been one of his many victims if not for the timely intervention of the police. Sarah never forgot the horror she had experienced that night. She warned everyone she knew about the dangers of ride-sharing services and urged them to be cautious when traveling alone. She knew that no one should have to go through the terror she had endured. But for Sarah, the damage had already been done. She would never be the same again.